welcome to the Bible Source Text Podcast. We are going to today jump right into Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 continues with the narrative of creation at first. This section of Genesis chapter 2 is kind of interesting because it almost feels like it should go into Genesis chapter 1. It kind of finishes the narrative that Genesis chapter 1 is telling before shifting to something else. It is important to remember that the chapter and verse signifiers that's not an original part of the text. That was added later to make individual verses easier to reference. This is a bit of an awkward way of organizing the text, but that was not original to the text. And so, the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their heavenly lights. By the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because on it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So this is the origin of the Jewish Sabbath. The text refers to rest, which does not have the connotation of weariness, but simply an end to work, ceasing from work. This was a common motif in ancient Near Eastern literature. Gods were often said to rest after the construction and dedication of their temples. This fits with what we talked about in the last episode with creation acting as a temple for God, and that being a part of this creation narrative. But it also acts as in a way, a model for human activity. Much, much later in the New Testament, in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus says, "The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath." The language here, for man, really means for the sake of man, for man's benefit. So it's this idea of having a day off is actually good for you, which I don't think anyone is going to argue with. It is worth pointing out this is not yet a commandment. You see this commonly in Seventh-day Adventist circles where they argue that the Sabbath command starts at creation, but we don't see that here. We don't actually see the command given until the Mosaic Law comes down at Mount Sinai. In the New Testament, in the book of Colossians, we even see the Apostle Paul seeming to say that the Sabbath is no longer binding on Christians, hence why Christians do sometimes work on Saturdays. No one's to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are only a shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So the Christian interpretation of the Sabbath is generally that it is a symbol of something higher, and that the substance is Christ. Paul even connects this to like the kosher diet and some of the Jewish festivals that Christians no longer celebrate either. So starting with verse 4, we see a change in focus. Some scholars have argued that this next part of the text conflicts with chapter 1. That chapter 1 has one creation narrative, chapter 2 has another. Personally, I don't see that. I don't see a conflict here. What I see is a change of focus. And throughout this, I've said to look at this as an ancient Near Eastern story, we need to look at it in terms of what meaning is being imparted to things, not necessarily, what actually happened. We can, the text just assumes these things happened. What it's actually arguing for is the meaning of the things that happened. But even that aside, I really see this as Chapter 2 narrowing the focus on the creation of humanity. Chapter 1 says that mankind's created on the sixth day. Chapter 2 says, here's what happened on the sixth day. So I don't really see this as a conflict. That said, when you look at something like the documentary hypothesis, where this is a compilation of things from different sources, I think you could make the argument this comes from possibly a different source than chapter 1. Again, with that change of focus, I don't necessarily see conflict, but I could see this coming from some other earlier source. So, chapter 4 starts with, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven. Now no shrub of the field was yet on the earth, no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. But a mist used to rise from the earth, and water the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The man became a living person. The Lord God planted a garden towards the east in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord caused every tree to grow that is pleasing to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." So this is the Garden of Eden. Eden is derived from the Akkadian word, meaning fruitful, fertile. So we've got this image of a fruitful garden, and God places mankind there to work, to cultivate the land. Now there's an interesting comparison and an interesting contrast with a lot of other ancient Near Eastern myths. In most ancient Near Eastern cultures, it was assumed that the gods needed to have their material needs served by man. A comparison you might make is to the epic of Atrahasis, which was a Mesopotamian myth which the gods created mankind to do work that they did not want to do themselves. You've got, in that particular myth, an image of the gods who are so sick of the drudgery of work that they create mankind to do it for them. Here you've got a very different image. You've got mankind working, but you've got mankind working from a position of authority. Work was being done for fulfillment, not to serve God's needs, because he has no needs. You've got actually the language here similar to that of a priest caring for a temple, which again reinforces this idea of creation as God's temple. You've also got almost the implication that man is the caretaker being trusted with the temple. Not just, this is mind-numbing drudgery that needs to be done and the gods reap the benefit, but more, this is something important that God is trusting man to do. So there is an element of authority in this that you don't see in a lot of other ancient Near Eastern myths. I think you could also make a comparison that, as I mentioned, in a lot of other ancient myths, gods needed to be fed. They actually needed food, and so food would be brought into the temples to provide sustenance for the gods. Here you've got, in contrast, God planting a garden to provide for human needs, to provide trees that are pleasing to the sight and good for food, as well as the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so you've got almost like a reversal of what you see in other ancient Near Eastern myths. You have mankind being created from the dust and then having divine breath given to him. That image of mankind being created from the ground is found in some other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Mesopotamia, again, if we go back to the epic of Atrahasis, we have mankind being made from clay, but the gods give blood and flesh to the clay, which then becomes a man. Egypt, you have the god Hunum creating mankind on a potter's wheel. There's another story that features, I believe it was Atum spitting on mankind to give life. There's a different story of Atum with different bodily fluids, but the less that's said about that, the better. That is his creation of other gods, not mankind. But the point is, you've got this idea of mankind being created from the earth and some sort of divine interaction that brings life to it. That is a common motif that is used here as well. The tree of life is mentioned. The text says that the tree of life is in the midst of the garden. The tree of life is a very common motif in ancient cultures around the world. Here in the Bible, we see the tree of life later in the New Testament. In the New Jerusalem, at the very end of the Bible, we see the tree of life in New Jerusalem as it descends from heaven. So there's this idea in Christianity of Eden someday being restored. You could draw comparisons to the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's a plant that translators have translated as the plant of the old man becomes a young man. Plant that actually reverses the aging process that Gilgamesh wants to use to achieve immortality. So that is a comparison to the Tree of Life. In ancient Babylonian myth, there's in the myth of Etana, searching for the plant of birth. Again, some sort of plant that gives life to people and creates life in that case. The Zoroastrians had the Gaukarena. I may be butchering that pronunciation, but that was a tree with life-giving and healing properties. Much later, Jewish mysticism used the tree of life as a symbol in Kabbalah. The Gnostics used this symbol, although Gnosticism was very decentralized, and they couldn't really agree on what the tree of life represented, with some sources saying that the tree of life kept Adam and Eve bound to the material, and that the serpent was a servant of the demiurge trying to keep them in creation. Others arguing that the tree of life represented gnosis, and that the serpent was a servant of the monad. The monad and the demiurge were divine figures in Gnosticism, with the demiurge creating creation in order to trap mankind in it, and the monad being sort of the prime divinity, sort of equivalent to God. At any rate, thousands of years later, when the Gnostics are around, this symbol was being used by them, even if they couldn't agree on what it actually meant. You also have in the garden the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's this idea that, evil is disobedience, so by choosing to disobey God's commands, as we'll see in a bit, spoilers I guess, Adam is able to experience evil. Thus Adam has knowledge of good and evil by choosing to disobey and experiencing evil. Moving on to verse 10. Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden. From there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon, it flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. The bdellium, which by the way was a type of tree resin that was used as an incense, and the onyx stone are there as well. The name of the second river is Gihon. It flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. It flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates, we know where those rivers are today. The author gives the location of the Tigris as flowing from Assyria. That was in Mesopotamia. The fourth river is the Euphrates. It's assumed that the reader will know where the Euphrates River is. The headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates River are both located in Iraq. So that would suggest Eden is in Iraq. Some commentators, especially within sort of the young earth creationist circles, have argued, well, this might not be the same Tigris and Euphrates River. There's a flood coming up soon in the narrative. Is it possible that it's some sort of pre-flood river that just happens to have the same name? I think that's kind of unlikely, only because the narrator is explaining this to the reader. This is not God telling Adam where he's at. This is whoever is writing this text telling the reader. They assume the reader knows where the Euphrates River is. So they are assuming if you don't know where the river Tigris is, well, you might know where Assyria is. So it seems likely that it is the same Tigris and Euphrates River we have today. Now, we don't know what the Pishon and Gihon rivers are. Those are unknown, though they give us a few hints in the text. Now, Josephus believed the Pishon to be the Ganges River in India and the Gihon to be the Nile River in Egypt. That would make the Garden of Eden quite large, and I don't know how a river would divide and become those four. I don't know how the geography of that would work. With that said, the text gives us the location of Havilah, where there's apparently a lot of gold and other precious stones. Havilah is possibly on the Arabian Peninsula, and there is some evidence of a dried riverbed, a former riverbed, that likely was still flowing with water at the time that this text was written, going across the Arabian Peninsula in an area that's historically been used for gold mining. So it is possible that that is the Pishon River. The Gihon River is said to flow around the whole land of Cush. Cush was in North Africa, which would match up with Josephus's identification of the river as the Nile, but to my knowledge, the Nile was never called the Gihon by anybody, so that is still a mystery. Moving on to verse 15, then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and tend it. We already talked about there's this idea of that being fulfilling work to maintain the temple, in a sense. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for on the day that you eat from it you will certainly die. There's been a lot of ink expended over the years over this phrase, certainly die. Some have interpreted this to mean a sort of a spiritual death. That is kind of where the medieval theologians draw the idea of original sin, the idea that you will be corrupted and separated from God as a result of that disobedience. Some have also interpreted this in a much more down-to-earth sense that on the day you eat it, it becomes a certainty that you will die. The message is ultimately the same. Death comes about as a result of sin and disobedience. Then the Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man, to see what he would call them. Whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the livestock, and to the birds of the sky, and to every animal of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. He slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that place, and the Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man. Now this is where I could see where people are coming from in the idea that this is a second narrative that conflicts with the previous narrative. At the same time, the only real possible conflict is the idea of God forming the animals out of the ground, which isn't mentioned in chapter 1. I still don't think it is a direct conflict so much as it is differing perspective. What we've got here in this section is the idea of Adam naming the animals. That had meaning to the ancients. Decreeing names was a grant of authority. The ability to decree a name or to change someone's name implied authority. Kings that subjected other kings would often give them new names. That was a way of saying, sort of, I own you. I am more powerful than you because I'm changing your name. So just as we saw earlier in the text, this is a sort of grant of authority to mankind. It's also the case that in a lot of ancient Mesopotamian myths, naming was seen to give something purpose. Something didn't have a purpose till it was given a name. In that sense, if creation is really about what purpose things are given, what meaning things are given, what we see here is Adam kind of taking a part in creation, Adam playing a part in the creation narrative. This name Adam is given to the man. Adam means human or mankind. It is kind of a term in general for a human being, for humans in Hebrew. But it's also a play on the Hebrew word Adamah, which is a term for earth. And so you've got Adam being formed out of the dust. There's a play on words there. So God fashions a woman out of a rib. The man said, "At last this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she is taken out of man." She's not actually given the name Eve here quite yet. That comes a little later. Though Eve is a anglicization of the Hebrew word, meaning the source of life. You've got Eve as a mother in her name. What Adam is referring to here, she should be called woman because she's taken out of a man. In Hebrew, man was ish, and woman is isha. So again, you've got kind of a pun there. The word for woman is derived from the word for man. This is a tangent and not really related to the biblical text, but it's worth just mentioning. On first glance, it kind of seems like an interesting coincidence that this works in English too, because it's easy to say, okay, the Hebrew word for woman is derived from the Hebrew word for man. Our words are man and woman. It would be easy to assume that that's the case. That's actually not the case. This actually doesn't work in English. That is the result of sort of historical accident. In Old English, the word man was a general term for human. We still see this in words like mankind, or just in the use of the word man as a term for humanity. That comes off as a bit sexist to us today, but in Old English, man meant human. And so instead, to refer to a man, you would use the term were man, were meaning male, man meaning human, male human, literally. The term for a woman was wife man, wife meaning female. Old English term wife does become the modern English term wife, meaning specifically a married woman. But wife man eventually becomes woman. For some reason, as English developed into its modern form, man came to mean a man, a male, and the were part was dropped, although it's been retained in the word werewolf. Werewolf is just man-wolf. So I just find it kind of interesting that it seems like this wordplay works in English as well as Hebrew, but it actually doesn't work in English. It's just by coincidence that it seems that way. As I said, that's not really much to do with the text, but I find it interesting. Verse 24, we'll finish with 24 and 25. "For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, but they were not ashamed." So you've got this idea of marriage being established at creation, and the relationship between Adam and Eve being given meaning by God through marriage. You've also got this little ending note that they were both naked and not ashamed. There's this message here that nudity is only shameful due to the enticement to sin. And without that enticement, it's innocent. It kind of implies naivety on Adam and Eve's part. I think you can draw comparisons to some other ancient Near Eastern stories and myths. There were plenty of ancient Near Eastern stories that associate nudity with being uncivilized, but we don't see that here. We see a different association with naivety and innocence. Maybe there's a loose connection there to the Epic of Gilgamesh, with Enkidu becoming civilized upon engaging in sexuality for the first time. If there's a connection there, as I said, it's very loose, but I could see someone making that argument. I don't think that's super strong connection, but I think there might be something there. That is where I will leave off for now. We will jump into chapter 3 next time. Thank you.